Chapter 5 of Syria 360, A Crisis Not a Problem, will discuss conflicts beyond Syria's border that had a large impact on the Syrian civil war. These conflicts led to the involvement and evolution of several of the main actors in Syria today, whose flags are all displayed here. In broad terms, the Kurdish-Turkish conflict created tensions between Turkey and the Democratic Union Party, or PYD, which Turkey believes to be an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. The Soviet-Afghan War birthed the Taliban and al-Qaeda. The Chechen-Russian conflict allowed Russian President Vladimir Putin to get involved in Syria by claiming he is fighting the war on terror to ensure Russia's security from presumed Chechen rebels in Syria. The Gulf War fueled anti-American sentiment in Iraq, and the subsequent second U.S. invasion of Iraq helped produce the Islamic State. And finally, the Arab Spring generated Syrian civil unrest, leading to mass protests, government killing of civilians, and eventually, civil war. The events and actors produced by such conflicts are necessary to understand who is currently participating in the Syrian civil war, how their involvement began, and why the war does not have one simple solution. In order to explain how these conflicts provided the necessary conditions for war, first the history of each conflict will be examined, followed by an explanation of what role its actors play in the current Syrian conflict. Section 1. The Kurdish-Turkish conflict beginning in 1978. The two main actors in this conflict are Turkey and the PKK, whose flags are shown here. 1978 is the year when Abdullah Öcalan established the PKK. For 2 decades after the PKK's founding, the organization believed the only solution to the so-called Kurdish question was a Kurdish state on territory that is currently claimed by Turkey, as displayed on the map. This Kurdish question can be traced back to the fall of the Ottoman Empire. When the empire fell, the Kurds took it as an opportunity to advocate for the creation of a Kurdish state. The subsequent Treaty of Sèvres, which created the modern states of Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait, provided territory for a Kurdish state as well. However, the Turks rejected it and only accepted a new treaty without provisions for Kurdistan. The remaining Kurdish population continued to disintegrate under the British in Iraq, the French in Syria, and the Persians. As a result, ethnic Kurds currently represent the largest stateless minority in the world. Multiple factors attracted Kurdish people to the PKK, including poverty and a desire to claim their right to Kurdish territory. Güneş Murat Tesk, a scholar of political science, reported that, in the words of a villager who became a PKK sympathizer in the late 1970s, poor people joined the PKK because they use a language understood by people. They were the only ones resisting oppression. Most join, however, to end the oppression they experience from the governments that rule over them and claim their national rights. In Turkey, the government has tried to outlaw Kurdish language and dress, dilute the population, and deny acknowledgement of Kurds as a minority group. The Iraqi Kurds have faced similar repression that will be discussed more later. These are issues that push Kurdish civilians towards the PKK. The PKK began to gain power over the next few years until 1984, when it initiated warfare against the Turkish state and became the hegemonic Kurdish Nationalist Party. Then, the Gulf War in 1991 helped the PKK expand its camps to northern Iraq and increase its weaponry and influence. The expansion of the PKK into northern Iraq still has a presence today, as shown on the map. Iraqi Kurds support this nationalist organization because of the oppression they have also experienced in Iraq. After the Kurds supported Iran in the 1980 Iran-Iraq War, the Iraqi president Saddam Hussein dropped chemical weapons on the town of Halabja. This attack was part of a genocidal campaign against Kurdish civilians, and in this attack alone, approximately 5,000 people died. The attack also demonstrates why the Kurds have been vying for an independent state and turning to violent means to get the world's attention. This flowchart shows how progress between Turkey and the PKK digressed when it initiated major attacks in 2007 against Turkey. These attacks led Turkish government officials to begin considering a more far-reaching military option. Thus, Turkey responded to these attacks by launching several air and land operations against PKK camps in Iraq. On November 5th, the U.S. President George W. Bush and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met and confirmed the PKK a common enemy. However, framing the PKK as a terror group is only half the narrative. The group conducted attacks to attempt to coerce the Turkish government into giving them the autonomy that the Treaty of Sèvres promised. Meanwhile, cooperation between Turkey and Syria resulted in the Turkish-Syrian Adana Agreement of 1998, which prevented Syrians from allowing the PKK in their territory. The renewed agreement of 2011 is displayed here. A Turkish security detail also managed to capture and imprison the PKK's leader Öcalan for a lifetime sentence. Öcalan published a new paradigm shortly after his incarceration, promoting a grassroots democracy that applied to all Kurdish areas regardless of national boundaries. The new paradigm did not threaten any state's territorial integrity and provided Turkey and the PKK with room to maneuver. Syria, however, would not tolerate these ideas if it meant loss of power and control of the central government. Syrian Kurds, who were heavily influenced by Öcalan's ideas, introduced their own political party known as the Democratic Union Party, or PYD, in 2003. For its first 10 years, the PYD operated covertly to avoid repression. With the beginning of the Syrian civil war and weakening of the Assad regime, the PYD began operating openly with two armed wings known as the People's Protection Units, or YPG, and the Women's Protection Units, or YPJ. The YPJ is a militia group solely made up of women. The PYD, YPG, and YPJ are actively fighting now in northern Syria and alongside the Kurdish Iraqi militia known as the Peshmerga in northern Iraq. The Kurdish-Turkish conflict clearly has a long history that began with the fall of the Ottoman Empire and division of the Kurdish people, as shown in the green box on the map. The PKK heavily influenced the current major Kurdish organizations fighting in Syria, such as the PYD, YPG, and YPJ, pictured in the two photographs on the right. Furthermore, because of Turkey's history with what it considers PKK terrorism, it does not trust these Syrian organizations. Thus, there are tensions between Turkey and the Kurds on their border in northern Syria. Section 2. The Soviet-Afghan War that began in 1979. The main actors in this conflict are the Russians, Afghani fighters, and foreign fighters. Russia, formerly known as the Soviet Union, shown in orange on the map, had a long and fairly friendly relationship with Afghanistan, which is shown in green. In the 1920s, modest amounts of Soviet aid and advisors entered the country and were a constant fixture for the next 50 years. This all changed in July 1973 when Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud Khan overthrew his cousin and set himself up as president. Some students who opposed switching to a parliamentary system from a monarchy dropped out of school and became guerrillas in the mountains. There they joined guerrillas that had their start by opposing the former king. These guerrillas were called the Mujahideen, or Holy Warriors, and are shown in this photograph alongside their flag in the top right. Daoud's rule did not last long. As the flowchart demonstrates, in April 1978, a communist coup overthrew him and established the poorly run Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, or DRA. Friendly relations between the Soviets and Afghans dissipated on December 23, 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to bolster the communist Afghan government. Initially, they met little opposition. However, eventually, Mujahideen resistance activated based on popular uprising. The Mujahideen initiated a holy war, or jihad, as a response to Soviet intervention in the 1980s. This war helped introduce al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Militant Islamists and Islamic fundamentalists came to Pakistan and Afghanistan to support the Afghan jihad. Some of these foreign fighters would later found and join al-Qaeda, while other Afghani mujahideen would form the Taliban. During the time period between 1979 and 1984, Saudi Arabia and the United States contributed $250 million to the Mujahideen anti-Soviet resistance. An operation titled Operation Cyclone outlined a tripartite alliance. Pakistan micromanaged the resistance through their intelligence agency. Saudi Arabia handled financing and religious propaganda, and the United States provided strategy, money, weapons, and technical assistance. The aid provided to the Mujahideen to foster a pan-Arab jihad became a major factor in strengthening al-Qaeda, since Afghanistan functioned as a so-called training camp for jihadists. U.S. aid spent $51 million on an educational grant beginning in 1984 to the University of Nebraska in Omaha and its Center for Afghanistan Studies. Their goal was to produce books in dominant Afghani languages to help stoke anti-Soviet hatred. Violent images and militant Islamic teachings emphasizing unremitting jihad filled the books like the photo on the right. The intention to try to instill religious fanaticism around young people had a long-term impact even after the war ended. In 1986, the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev announced the Afghanization of the war and eventual withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan by 1989. However, withdrawal of Soviet troops did not necessarily mean peace. After victory against the Soviets in the 1990s, civil war between Mujahideen warlords fell upon Afghanistan. Shortly after, in 1994, the Taliban formed from an Afghan faction of Mujahideen and younger Pashtun tribesmen who studied in Pakistani madrasas. A man named Mullah Omar and his students rescued 2 girls abducted by a local commander and hung him as punishment. This event made Mullah Omar a local hero. Then he and a group of Mujahideen and Pakistani students created the Taliban to bring pure Islam back to Afghanistan. Mullah Omar later befriended Osama bin Laden, leader of al-Qaeda, and by 1999 the Taliban controlled Afghanistan, displayed in green on the map. The Soviet-Afghan War has a seemingly small role in the emergence of the Syrian civil war, but that is not necessarily true. U.S. funding of the Mujahideen warriors essentially provided training and weapons to thousands of holy warriors, some of whom would later make up the Taliban and al-Qaeda. Furthermore, the original founder of the Islamic State, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, pictured post-mortem on the left, joined the Mujahideen in 1989. He later teamed up with bin Laden, pictured on the right, in 2004 to found al-Qaeda in the Land of Two Rivers, or AQI. AQI would later evolve into the Islamic State after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Therefore, the Soviet-Afghan War provided the basis and resources of the major names in terrorism that we see today in Afghanistan, Iraq, and most importantly, Syria. Section 3. The Chechen-Russian Wars, beginning in 1994 and 1999. The 2 main actors in these wars are the Russians and Chechen civilians. On December 1st, 1994, the conflict between Chechnya in red and Russia in white ignited due to the Chechen desire for an independent state. As a result, beginning in February 1995, foreign fighters began to enter the Caucasus with the goal of defending Muslim Chechen citizens from the Russians. The Kashmir Accord, signed on August 30, 1996, ended the First War and left a semi-autonomous Chechen state based on national secular principles. However, the republic quickly became a hub for foreign fighters who brought with them a form of Islamic fundamentalism called Wahhabism. Peace did not last for long. In 1999, the Second Chechen War commenced, which Russia viewed as an internal threat. Putin feared that Chechen separatism and Wahhabi influence could spill over into Russian regions. The fear of spillover of what he considered radical Islamists infiltrating into Central Asia and Russia proper is still perpetuated by Russia regarding Syria today. Following September 11, 2001, Russia presented the North Caucasus as the Russian front on the global war on terror. It exaggerated foreign fighter presence to excuse its effort. Russia also continued to use this strategy to link Chechnya and the global war on terror throughout the Second Chechen War. It used an al-Qaeda-Chechen nexus, which had partial truth, but the government overstated it in order to gain support for its involvement in Chechnya. Russia had narrow concerns regarding international criticism on Chechnya, U.S. support for counterterrorism, and removal of the Taliban from Afghanistan. Hannah Knott, a scholar of international relations, describes Moscow's counterterrorism argument to be the same for the Chechen conflict and now the Syrian conflict. First, since the terrorist threat Russia faces is civilizational, other concerns are secondary. And second, any distinction between good and bad opponents in the conflict is to be rejected. As a result, Russia justifies its involvement in Syria today as a means of fighting global terrorism, as shown on the map, as it did with the Chechen conflicts. However, its real motives are the same as they were during the Chechen conflicts as well: to reduce the internal threat to Russia by preventing supposed Chechen fighters in Syria from returning to the North Caucasus. In doing so, it can ensure domestic security and continue to pursue its geostrategic goals in the region, like keeping its military bases in Syria. Section 4. The 1990 Gulf War and the 2003 Iraq War. The main actors in these wars are the United States and Iraq. The Gulf War set the scene for the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which in turn destabilized the region and led to the creation of the fundamentalist group known as the Islamic State. The Gulf War began on August 2, 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, which prompted the United Nations to impose economic sanctions on Iraq. In November, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 678 that demanded Iraq withdraw from Kuwait by January 15, 1991. After Iraq's president, Saddam Hussein, failed to comply with the UN resolutions, on January 16, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began. This was an American-led military campaign involving a coalition of 30 countries shown in blue on the map. The coalition proved successful when Iraqi forces withdrew from Kuwait shortly after in February. This is the first instance of U.S. intervention in Iraq, and it fueled anti-American sentiment there and in other parts of the Arab world. September 11, 2001 marks the turning point for American politics in the Middle East. Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 3 planes and ultimately killed approximately 3,000 people. In response to 9/11, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001 to overthrow the Taliban and end the Taliban-Al-Qaeda nexus. It also invaded Iraq on March 20, 2003 to oust the government. The Iraq War, titled Operation Iraqi Freedom, aroused intense emotions in the Arab world. The biggest initial failures of the United States were its inability to provide basic services to Iraqi civilians, the de-Baathification of the government, and the disassembly of the army. Paul Bremer was chiefly responsible for these actions as he was the top civilian administrator of the American-led Coalition Provision Authority, or CPA. The CPA had primary executive authority over Iraq, but Iraqi citizens viewed it as an occupying authority. Bremer issued CPA Orders 1 and 2 in May 2003. CPA Order 1 barred Iraqis who ranked in the top 4 levels of Saddam's Ba'ath Party or held positions in the top 3 levels of each ministry from government work. CPA Order 2 disbanded the Iraqi army and replaced it with an army built from scratch. These orders left tens of thousands of former employees under Saddam's Sunni government, many of which had government and military training, without work and no place to go. As a result, they joined militias in Iraq and crossed Syria's border. Anti-American sentiment grew in Syria after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which caused a widespread desire to fight there. Therefore, people began to travel between Iraq and Syria, and Syrian authorities did little to prevent it. Meanwhile, the Syrian Ba'ath Party was widely accused of organizing recruitment of volunteers from across the country to join the resistance in Iraq. The Iraqi foreign minister at the time claimed that 5,000 volunteers had gone to Iraq within 11 days. Furthermore, there were estimates that 1,000 Palestinians from a refugee camp came 2 days later and that the jihad had sent a wave of willing suicide bombers to Iraq. Elements within the Syrian security apparatus facilitated the migration of Arabs to Iraq. Also, popular pan-Arabist unity and inter-Ba'athist loyalties between Syria and Iraq ensured that networks advanced and expanded. Another factor that led to the rise of fighters in Iraq and Syria were detention camps. The U.S. set up Camp Bucca and other detention centers shortly after the invasion to imprison military-aged men suspected of terrorist activity. Early mistakes during this process included keeping inmates in too large of compounds, putting the so-called worst of the worst together, and staffing the camps with soldiers with limited knowledge of the language and culture. Centers like Camp Bucca localized and concentrated the fighter problem to a point where they wanted to be captured to go there. Similar to the Afghani training camps during the Soviet-Afghan War, violent fundamentalists in these detention centers were said to indoctrinate younger detainees by hosting classes on how to use explosives, weapons, and how to become suicide bombers. Therefore, they were able to create a deadly network of fighters who reconvened after release. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the current leader of the Islamic State, was held in Camp Bucca and released in December 2004, deemed not a significant threat. As previously mentioned, in 2004, Zarqawi, the mastermind behind the Islamic State, teamed up with bin Laden to create AQI. In 2006, Zarqawi established the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISI, after he broke off from al-Qaeda. This announcement demonstrated that the group had attained a new level. They began to try building an Islamic State. In response, tribes in Iraq created the Anbar Awakening Council in September 2006 to battle ISI with the backing of U.S. training, weaponry, and money. The pressure from influential tribal leaders caused foreign fighter flow to slow. Simultaneously, the U.S. began its surge of Iraq and ordered over 20,000 Army and Marine forces to Baghdad, the suburbs, and Anbar province. This combination proved to be very effective at reducing the insurgent and sectarian violence, and by 2009, ISI had almost been destroyed. Despite the progress the U.S. made, U.S. military forces completed withdrawal from Iraq on December 18, 2011, nearly 3 years after the Status of Forces Agreement was signed in 2008. The The Status of Forces Agreement required the United States to release many former and future fighters held at Camp Bucca who were viewed as less threatening. The more threatening detainees were supposed to continue their imprisonment, but were put under the authority of the Iraqi government. Unfortunately, in July 2013, thousands of Islamic State and al-Qaeda fighters were broken out of jail by their compatriots while in the care of the Iraqi government. The following year, in 2014, the Islamic State declared a caliphate that covered Iraq and Syria. The Gulf War and U.S. invasion of Iraq provided widespread anti-American sentiment in Iraq and the surrounding areas. The Iraq War of 2003 provided the fuel to non-state actors in Iraq and Syria to exploit weaknesses in both countries. The United States also disrupted a set of fragile power relations in Iraq and other neighboring countries held in check by Saddam Hussein. The subsequent de-Baathification of the government and disbandment of the Iraqi army furthered the issue because it left many government-trained citizens without jobs. By forcing government and military-trained personnel out of work in Iraq, U.S. actions essentially precipitated the future masterminds of the Islamic State, which currently controls a large part of Syria and Iraq, shown in black on the map. These wars are arguably the most important in driving the conflict that would later become the Syrian Civil War. Section 5. The Arab Spring that began in 2010. Though many countries participated in the Arab Spring, in this instance, the main actors are the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, and Syrian civilians. In December 2010, Tariq al-Tayyid Mohammed Bouazizi initiated the Arab Spring in Tunisia by immolating himself. Fed up by mistreatment from government officials, he wanted to make a statement that could not be ignored. This event caused mass civilian protests for democracy in other Middle Eastern countries shown on the map. The Syrian Arab Spring began the next year in March 2011. The Arab Spring in other countries and President Assad's crackdown on protesters prompted the demonstrations. Militant indigenous groups, which will be discussed in more detail in Chapter 6, quickly emerged and attracted thousands of foreign fighters. These groups also remobilized dormant foreign fighters from Afghanistan and other countries in the region. March 15, 2011 marks the official start of the Syrian conflict. The continuation of widespread civil unrest caused by socioeconomic and Islamist problems proved too much for the country to bear. Since 2012, Syria has become a magnet for foreign fighters. In December 2013, estimates claim that between 3,300 and 11,000 foreign fighters had traveled to Syria, the largest mobilization since the Soviet-Afghan War. The Arab Spring can be considered the catalyst to the start of the Syrian Civil War. All of the previously mentioned conflicts created the conditions for the development of regional instability. However, the Arab Spring triggered civil unrest that led to a full-fledged war. The PYD, YPG, YPJ, PKK, Chechen foreign fighters, Iraqi foreign fighters, al-Qaeda, and the Islamic State are major players in Syria, but had their beginnings in external conflicts that took place beyond Syria's borders. All they needed was a spark that would provide an opportunity for them to convene in a common area and exploit its weaknesses. After examining these wars and clashes, it can be deduced that conflict provides weak links in any state system that can be manipulated by fighters and government leaders. Mistakes made by the United States in the Iraq invasion got the ball rolling until the Arab Spring completely plunged Syria into a full-fledged war. Regional conflicts, poorly planned interventions of larger powers, and civil unrest provide the conditions necessary for localized wars to break out, like in the case of Syria. Once war breaks out, it is easier for insurgents, terrorists, and other militia groups, such as the Islamic State, to take control of small pockets of land and slowly attempt to establish their own order and power. The militia groups discussed here in Chapter 5 will be discussed more thoroughly next in Chapter 6. Thank you.